gentlemen. Once again, I want to thank Jim and the Gun Boosters for inviting me to this opening night excitement. There's something very, very special about the energy of an opening night. And I also would remind myself not to take for granted how lucky we are to have a high school drama department that can do Shakespeare. And not only do it, but do it well. And recognize the sort of the enormity of the challenge. Sir Ian McKellen called acting Shakespeare the Himalayas for an actor. I mean, it's the very peak, the toughest. Dustin Hoffman, when he was doing Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, when he was rehearsing the performance in London and got a little frustrated at one point, he stated the challenge a little less elegantly. He said, "You can't improvise this shit." Anyway. We're very, very lucky to be able to experience Shakespeare here tonight. I will indeed, I will indeed. In talking about The Merchant of Venice, it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that this is a romantic comedy. I may be reminding you of that a few times in the next 15 minutes. Commentary on the play inevitably refers to things like the play's tortured complexity or its power to disturb. In The Friendly Shakespeare, Norrie Epstein says simply, quote, "The play drives me nuts." Okay? Now, the approach I'd like to take in trying to keep perspective is to focus on the idea of a critic named Roland Barthes, who claimed that one of the marks of a superior work of literature is its ability to produce in us a healthy confusion, he called it, of pleasure and disquietude. I even have a title for my talk for the first time, I think. Pleasure and disquietude. So what does that mean? There are a lot of sources of pleasure in this play, and let's not lose sight of that. It is at times almost a fairy tale. In this play, as he often does, Shakespeare is making use of contrasting places. So Venice is the down-to-earth sort of grainy side of life. Belmont is the idealized and romanticized. Now, I deliberately stay away from rehearsals of this play. I want to see it fresh tonight with the same eyes you're seeing it with. But Jim does tell me that tonight's play is going to be set in Manhattan, that's Venice, and Martha's Vineyard will be Belmont, and it'll be 2008, just before the financial crash. So you'll see the relevance of that. But it is kind of like a fairy tale. Living in Belmont / Martha's Vineyard is the beautiful and charming and clever and witty Portia. Her father, her late father, in his will declared that anyone who wants to win Portia's hand in marriage must in fact choose one of 3 caskets, a lead casket, a silver casket, and a gold casket. To win Portia and her sizable fortune, by the way, he must choose the casket with Portia's picture in it. And I will tell you that anyone who chooses one of the other 2 caskets is forsworn to a life of celibacy. So the stakes are pretty high in this one. Now, one of the many suitors, and so we'll have some funny suitors, the Prince of Morocco, the Prince of Aragon, they'll be the first 2 people to choose. Portia will talk about a lot of other suitors. She can be really kind of nasty sometimes, very saucy, and we'll see that. But anyway, one of the suitors, and the one she's most interested in, is a Venetian named Bassanio, who unfortunately has squandered his fortune, and he cannot woo Portia in the manner to which he is accustomed. So Bassanio goes to his dear friend, I'll talk about that in a minute, his dear friend Antonio. Unfortunately, the wealthy Antonio, he's the merchant of Venice. All of his money is tied up in ships coming from various parts of the world laden with rich cargo, but he has no money, so he turns to the Jewish moneylender Shylock, asking for 3,000 ducats. Shylock agrees, and in just a jovial little gesture says that in the unlikely event that Antonio forfeit his bond, Antonio must give Shylock a pound of flesh. Okay, just a little jolly little joke. Now, the romance continues. We have a couple of other. Gratiano, a Venetian. I love, someone says of him, you see how much he talks. Someone said, quote, "He speaks an infinite deal of nothing more than any man in Venice." And Gratiano will fall in love with Portia's handmaiden, Nerissa. That's a nice little love story. And then Shylock has a daughter, Jessica. for whom Mr. Dunlap's wife is named, I just learned, Jessica, and a Venetian named Lorenzo will fall in love with her, and so we have a sufficient love interest. Lots of fun with the caskets. Lots of fun with, because this is a Shakespeare comedy after all. Portia and Nerissa will disguise themselves as men, happens frequently. And then there's really funny business with the rings. They managed to talk Bassanio and Gratiano out of their wedding rings, and then they have to explain like hell how they gave them. Anyway, you'll see all of this in Acts 4 and 5. And then, of course, we throw in one of Shakespeare's clowns. So we have Lancelot, who is in his old gobbo, his father, and Lancelot with all kinds of malapropisms, and we just got a lot of buffoonery there. So, folks, there is a lot for us to enjoy in what is a comedy, and of course, eventually, friendship and love will triumph over faithlessness and hatred, because that's again what happens in a comedy. But here goes the other shoe. This being a superior work of literature, we're also disquieted. There's a lot of gray in this play. The opening line of a comedy is Antonio, who says, "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." That's our opening line in the comedy. And there's all kinds of gray. The nature of his love, question mark about if you can see it back, the nature of his love is a very strong love between Antonio and Bassano. Just the nature of it's a bit ambiguous. It may be homoerotic. Maybe more likely it's a little bit of Renaissance Neoplatonism, where perfect friendship and spiritual union were thought to be superior to sexual gratification or fulfillment. But in any case, in the end, he will lose Bassanio when he marries Portia, and he ends up being, Antonio ends up being the odd man out very, very much. And then, disturbing, the exemplary Christian Antonio manifests his Christian charity by kicking, cursing at, and spitting on a fellow human being. And in fact, the Christians in the play are frequently kind of hypocritical and generally pretty unchristian. So there's a little bit of gray, a little unsettling there. And then, of course, the fellow human being who is the recipient of Antonio's vituperation and phlegm is Shylock. And this is where the play gets very, very dark indeed. In Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, Harold Bloom says, quote, "One would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb not to recognize that Shakespeare's grand equivocal comedy is nevertheless a profoundly anti-Semitic work." Now, I think it's worth noting that Bloom immediately adds that we may be, quote, "reasonably certain that Shakespeare himself was not personally anti-Semitic." And that's a view, by the way, echoed by James Shapiro in a very interesting book called Shakespeare and the Jews. Now, it's possible, so let's put the play in its historical context. It's possible, although not absolutely sure, that Shakespeare, in fact, wrote this play to capitalize on anti-Semitic feelings when in 1594, a Portuguese Jewish physician to Queen Elizabeth, a man named Rodrigo Lopez, was in fact hanged, drawn, and quartered for allegedly trying to poison Queen Elizabeth. And we know that Marlowe, for instance, we know for sure that Marlowe did a revival of his anti-Semitic play, The Jew of Malta. And it may be that Shakespeare even wrote this play to try to best his rival, Marlowe. Again, that's all a little bit iffy. But that's the context. And it didn't take much to fan anti-Semitic flames in this day. There were still bizarre medieval superstitions that had led to the Jews were nominally excluded from England in 1290 by Edward I. And some of the things from those days just persisted. Now, Shylock in this play most clearly embodies the Jew as the greedy, grasping usurer. He says of Antonio early in the play, "I hate him for he is a Christian. But more than that, in low simplicity, he lends out money gratis and brings down the rate of usance here in Venice." Now, Shapiro claims that the current, to quote him, "the current scholarly focus on usury has included more widespread and disturbing conceptions of Jewish criminality. One conception was that Jews abducted Christian children, circumcised them, and then ritually slaughtered them, using their blood, among other things, for unleavened bread at Passover." And that's the bizarre kinds of things that people believed in. Shapiro even suggests that the murder and circumcision are obliquely embodied in the pound of flesh that Shylock demands. He makes a very interesting argument that I won't go into at this point. Now, why am I dwelling on all of this unpleasantness? The point is that the play cannot be presented as it was intended, as it was written. It just can't be. It would not simply disquiet us, it would appall us. And there wouldn't be any pleasure from watching the play. I think it's a parallel that comes to mind is the perhaps somewhat less appalling misogyny in The Taming of the Shrew. So after Kate has been physically and emotionally abused by her husband, she in the last act tells women, among other things that would gag anyone but Rush Limbaugh, that quote, "Thy husband is thy Lord, thy life, thy keeper," are you listening, women? "Who craves no other tribute at thy hands, but love, fair looks, and true obedience." Okay. And you know, I have never seen that play presented straight, and I can't imagine it would be presented other than that last speech being heavily ironic and things leading up to it. So now the question is, how does one make The Merchant of Venice similarly, at least more palatable, without rewriting it? Now, some have tried to make Shylock an entirely sympathetic figure of tragic pathos. But here I agree with Bloom that this makes the rest of the play incomprehensible. It makes Portia a sadist, a quibbling sadist, rather than the sort of plucky heroine that most people like to see her as. Those who try to want to make Shylock more sympathetically human, cite his famous speech pleading for recognition of his common humanity. "I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die?" I would suggest, though, that the sad and most important truth about common humanity comes in his next lines. "If you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that." What Shylock calls Christian example leads him to believe, mistakenly I think, that his only possible response to abuse is to abuse in kind. That Shylock is a Jew, it seems to me, is significant only in that anti-Semitic abuse is the initial provocation. His mistaken belief that retaliation is the only possible response is an all too common human failing. When he's asked at his trial why he would rather have a pound of Antonio's flesh than thousands of ducats, they offer him more than the bond is worth, he refuses. And he suggests, sadly, that the situation is beyond his control. He says, "So can I give no reason, nor I will not, more than a lodged hate and a certain loathing that I bear Antonio." A lodged hate and a certain loathing. Bloom suggests that's a pretty good definition of anti-Semitism. In seeing only the possibility of retaliation, an out-of-control Shylock has become what he beheld in Antonio. To me, the play addresses not a Jewish failing, but a human failing. It's no different in Shylock from what it is in Antonio. I've struggled with this little talk tonight. I don't know if that's clear or not. And I found great comfort in something that Nori Epstein, whom I quoted earlier, she says, "The play supports almost any reading you care to give it. And like the caskets, the one you choose reveals more about you than about the play." Now, I hope that doesn't mean I've been talking more about myself than about but I also hope that that perspective will in some way contribute to what you choose to see in tonight's performance of a comedy. He reminded his audience and himself once again. Disquieted we may be, but I know from my long association with Jim and with Gun Theater that we're in for a great deal of pleasure as well. Well, thanks again to the Gun Boosters, and enjoy the play.